clip one of these days. Maybe there we go. All right. It's a little earlier than we usually start, so we may have some more people coming in. But we are, of course, starting a study of Philippians. And I hate to say that we're on Philippians because if you read your lesson today, you can see we're not technically in Philippians yet. We are second week in a row now looking at the book of Acts and looking at Paul's travels and Paul's journeys and what led him to write the letter to the Philippians. We saw last week Paul go to Philippi, why he went to Philippi, what he did while he was there, getting thrown in jail, all the different things that happened to him while he was there, Lydia and the jailer and all those things. And he's going to leave, of course. He's not going to stay there as Paul does. He doesn't stay anywhere forever for sure, and for some places not very long. He's going to leave, and what we're going to see now is we're going to see the time Paul left Philippi until the time basically he writes the letter, okay? And there's a few years in there. There's a few years in there between when he left and when he writes the letter. I don't know the exact time period, but I know he's in jail for a long time. And I say jail, it's not always what we would consider jail. He's under, you call it house arrest or whatever for a while. But anyway, he does these things. And I thought as I read this, the one thing I got out of this lesson, got a couple of things. One thing I got out of this lesson is when we read these letters that Paul wrote, sometimes I just look at them as a letter Paul wrote. Here's his letter to the Philippians. I think giving it some context helps a little. I'm not saying you can read the book of Philippians and not know the context around it, and you can still get a lot out of it. But if you know the context in which he wrote it and what happened before and between, I think it means a little bit more. He just didn't sit down all of a sudden one day and decide to write a letter to the Philippians. The events of his life led up to that. And I think that's what happens with us. You know, if you look at any event in your life, sometimes it may happen in a vacuum, but rarely it does. Usually events in your life are on a progression. They lead up to things, you know. Things you do are done for a reason. And Paul's writings and Paul's travels and all those kind of things were done with a purpose and were done with a reason. They weren't random, and they weren't just Paul decided one day just to sit down and write a letter to the Philippians. Okay, so that's kind of one thing I got out of that. If you look at the verses, you'll see this is one of the longer selections that we'll ever have in this book, and we're not going to read it word for word right now. I hope you had a chance to before we came in today. I hope you had a chance to look at it, but we're not going to read it word for word. But we are going to obviously refer to it quite a bit. But we're going to start kind of at not really a random point, but we're going to start basically with Paul being in jail. And once again, when I say in jail, sometimes that just means in chains. That doesn't always mean he was in the kind of jail we think of. Sometimes he was being held under house arrest. Sometimes he was just being held captive. He was waiting trial, things like that. But we'll use the term in jail or in chains, and you know it doesn't always mean exactly the same thing that we think about it today. But when we get started here, he has been in jail for quite some time, and he is facing some pretty harsh punishments. And I'm going to see if this. You need a book. See if this leads to anything here. Kind of what's happening. See if you can read my mind a little bit. Paul is facing some pretty heavy charges, and what's his final decision? What's he say? How's he gonna clear himself? Yeah, go to Rome. Okay, he's not in Rome right now, and that's the crux of our story today. Is he is on his way? He's going to be on his way. Is Rome? So, like David said, appeal to Caesar. That's his plan. That's his defense, and it's not a bad defense. We know Paul's Roman citizen. We talked about that quite a bit last week. Paul's Roman citizen. What do they have on Paul as far as charges go? You don't have to be exact. They're pretty flimsy, right? They're pretty flimsy charges. They're made up things on Paul, okay? A lot of it's coming from the Jews, the best I understand, from the Jewish leaders that are blaming Paul for what? Stirring up trouble, causing ruckuses, all this kind of stuff.